Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery. I'm Maya Soma, and I'm here with Bhante Sudaso to my right and Bhante Jayasara to my left. Good to see you, friends. For Monk Chat, you're welcome to ask any questions you might have on Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, and we'll try our best to answer your questions. And hello to Charles Lee, Rick, Christine, Kumu, John, Deborah, Melissa, Anonymous, and Mary. So whenever you're ready, feel free to type in your questions and we'll try our best to answer them. So Charles Lee is writing, welcome back to the States, Venerables. Thank you. Did you use personal watches or clocks during your tudong? Bhante Sudaso, would you like to answer that?
Yeah, we had clocks.
Hello to Bhante Sumita. So can we, I don't know how we can. Well, first maybe you can answer that there.
I just did. I said we had clocks.
Oh, okay. I didn't. That's it. And Rick says, Venerables, I practice the 5 precepts and frequently the 8 precepts. I practice not killing any living beings. I don't own guns, nor do I participate in the sale of weapons. Does the Buddha offer any guidance on how we leave these precepts in society? Do we focus in our own practice, leaving issues of society alone, or do we support laws that are in alignment with these precepts? Anybody wants to pick up this question?
Well, it's important to recognize that the Buddha's teachings are to be applied to every aspect of our lives. So the Buddha never said that his teachings only apply to certain things and not to other things. The Buddha, for example, he never said that we should only apply the Dhamma when we're in the temple, but not apply it when we're outside of the temple. He never said that we should only apply the Dhamma when we're practicing meditation, but not when we aren't practicing meditation. Similarly, the Buddha never said that we should not apply the Dhamma to political matters or matters of laws and society and regulations and so on. So I would say absolutely yes, you should apply the principles of Dhamma when making political decisions, legal decisions, cultural and societal decisions. Of course you should apply the Dhamma in those situations, because you should apply the Dhamma in all situations. So yeah, you should consider what the Dhamma has to say when making decisions related to anything in your life, without exception. So yes, that definitely includes laws and political matters.
Okay, thank you, Bhante. And Anonymous asks, if one is vegan and becomes a monastic, if they're offered meat, could one just accept it but not eat it? Bhante Jay, would you like to answer that?
This is something where that there's a level of personal choice in this. The Buddha did, give the monastics the option to become vegetarian or not. And so I think you'd get a variety of different answers from this, from different monastics. Some might be, vegan, and if they're offered meat, they might have it because it was offered. Some might say, no, I don't have meat, and some might accept it and then just not eat it. So it's a lot of variety of, in different monastics would have different perceptions on that. So I don't think there's any just one answer, but yeah, you could accept it and then not eat it.
Great, thank you, Venerable. And Shadow of Label asked, did you get into a pacifist battle with Catholic monks in kindness and compassion? Actually, we didn't get into any battle. It was really refreshing because we were both just interested in getting to know each other as siblings, as spiritual siblings. So yeah, nobody was trying to convince the other of anything, nor trying to force actually any kind of common thought or common common idea, but rather it was more an exchange of what our spiritual practices. No different than, if you meet someone from a different culture, you just start asking them, how they make their food, what their recipes are, and yeah, you're not trying to say that pasta is better than rice, or getting into a kind of any type of competition, but rather there is that curiosity and interest in understanding the other person better. So it was really refreshing and beautiful. So there was lots of kindness and compassion, and well, maybe pacifism as well, but no battle. And Jay Kala says, "Where did you all go on Tudong? Can you tell us about what you all did and what practices you followed and gained from it? Thank you." Well, Bante Sudaso.
Sure. We actually gave a talk on the subject this morning, so you might also refer to that. So I'll give a shorter answer at this time. So we were walking along part of the Camino di San Benedetto, the path of Saint Benedict, which is a walking path, a pilgrimage route that connects many of the most important sites related to Saint Benedict. So this is a route that is northeast of Rome. So we started from the town of Subiaco, which is a small town about an hour or so from Rome. And from there we were walking north along the path of Saint Benedict. So we were walking about 20 kilometers a day or so, 20, 25 kilometers, depending on the day. So we would camp in the forest at night, and then in the morning we would walk to the nearest town where we would do our alms round and see if anyone wanted to give us any food. And usually there would be some interaction with people, talking about the Dhamma, answering questions about Buddhism. Then after lunch, we might walk a little bit, have a rest, do some meditation in the forest, and then in the evening, walk for a few more hours and find somewhere to camp. So just doing this practice day after day, and primarily, as I mentioned this morning, it's primarily a practice for ourselves. It's a practice of equanimity, a practice of persistence, and a practice of compassion. So a practice of making ourselves available to the world as a representation of spiritual practice, and as a reminder to people that there are spiritual values in the world that can be applied and followed. So that's a brief answer, but maybe Ayasama would like to say a bit more on this.
Well, we gave a whole speech this morning, so I think, that unless you have specific questions, maybe about what Bante Sudaso just addressed, we kind of gave a sort of generic overview of our practice in the live stream that we gave this morning, which is titled After the Tudong. All right, thank you. And good to see you, Anna Maria. Lovely. And Sin says, "Hello, dear Venerables. Can you help me understand what is the meaning of non-dualism?" Jay?
I don't know if I'd be good to answer that question. Like, I don't know if I can give a detailed understanding of non-dualism, at least in terms of like the Mahayana. So probably not the best thing for me. I
can share just one of the suttas, actually. I think that is very good as a reference that we chant on a regular basis here at Empty Cloud Monastery, which is the Kacchanagotta Sutta. And there the invitation is basically to kind of focus on how our mind normally goes towards duality. So, for example, towards existence and non-existence. So we tend to think that either things, exist once again, or they don't exist at all. And the teachings of the Buddha instead are not about existence and non-existence, but rather they are the middle way, which normally have so many different ideas of what the middle way is, but rather essentially the middle way, non-duality way, is essentially understanding that everything is paticca samuppada, everything is dependently arisen. So in that way, maybe that's a short way to address this, if that makes sense. And I don't know if Dr. Sudaza wants to add something else.
Yeah, I would also point out that what is most clearly non-dual in the Theravada system is nibbana. So one way of talking about it very simply is that non-dualism is nibbana and dualism is samsara. So properly speaking, we're not trying to get rid of dualism per se, but rather to understand dualism and also to understand non-dualism. So it's not that one is better than the other. There's a Zen quote which actually sums this up very perfectly. So the Zen quote goes, "Not two, not one."
Okay, thank you. And Bhavani says, question. Oops. As namakandas are anicca and anatta, how will they pass on to next rebirths?
They won't. Nothing passes on. Rather, the conditions that we create in one moment determine the conditions to be experienced in the next moment. But nothing passes from moment to moment. That's actually a complete misunderstanding of causality. Rather, in each moment we make choices which then condition subsequent moments. But nothing passes on.
Great, thank you.
I've never heard that term namakandas. Is she talking about like the feeling, perception, sankharas, contact, and attention, like the khandas related to not the body, basically?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Robert asks, can learning to be bored be helpful in meditation, or is boredom a sign that we're doing something wrong?
No, boredom is a sign that you're observing how your mind works. That's what boredom is. Right? You start to follow your breath, and 2 seconds later, your mind goes off because your mind is bored with the breath. It doesn't see anything interesting in it. It just wants to go and find something else to be interested in. So this is something that is very common for all practitioners, that boredom is going to arise. And what we should do is to really understand this boredom, right? Because this boredom is one of those mind states that will cause you to act, right? Like, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm bored, and then I'm going to do something else, right? And oftentimes that boredom can cause us to act in unskillful ways, right? Because the mind is trying to find some kind of stimulus, something more interesting. I'm bored with meditating. Let's go to the club or something. Let's go do this. Let's go raise heckat on the town, right? So this boredom is an aspect of our experience, an aspect of our mind. It's the mind not wanting to deal with what's there. You can think about, watch your mind when you're away from any kind of music, any kind of entertainment, any kind of videos. I know what my mind does when I lose mindfulness. My mind automatically starts singing a song. Something just comes up, right? Because it's bored. It doesn't like silence. It doesn't like an empty mind, a quiet body. It doesn't like that. It wants to have some kind of stimulus. And so even if you don't have any music going on around you, your mind will create music. Your mind will create something. So you say, can learning to be bored be helpful in meditation? Practicing patience and understanding and dealing with the boredom, that's what will help with meditation. Patient endurance. Right? This is boring, your mind says. Well, we're going to stick with it. To go against that impulse to want to find something else. Oftentimes, it might help to try to focus on something to investigate. something to be mindful about. Because when you're mindful, you start to see things, and then you get curious, and then you want to investigate them, and energy arises, and there's no boredom. So try to observe, like for instance, if you get bored with the breath, instead of jumping somewhere else, try to really focus in on some specific aspect of the breath. Try to observe the breath deeper, right? Or just switch to the body if you need to. But boredom is just a natural part of the fact that we have craving, and that the mind is seeking entertainment, seeking activity, seeking things to do.
Great. Thank you, Bante. And Pinto asks, how many people are practicing Buddhism in Italy? Well, this would be a good question for the Italian Buddhist Union that tracks these numbers. So I don't have the answer right now, but what I can say is that actually there would be a lot more people if there were a lot more monastics who spoke Italian and went to Italy. And because there is actually a lot of interest. So this is what we've been seeing both this month while we were traveling around, and also in November, the past November, when we were also traveling in Italy and giving teachings. And we've been invited in several different places. Some were actual Buddhist temples, and some were just either secular spaces or someone's backyard, all the way to different spiritual communities. So there's lots of interest, and many more people would be practicing Buddhism if that was available. Essentially, it's kind of like saying how many people would eat, Italian food in Thailand. Well, if there were more Italian restaurants, then more people would be eating it. So, and AS says, thank you for the tiritzin. You're very welcome. Aya, can you please comment on when one's fervorous nature has been laid down, when the mind has been expanded and is not constricted by sensual pleasures? This is called going against the stream. So you are quoting Aya Dhammadina Bhikkhuni's verses from the Therigatha, which are beautiful verses. And essentially, I would say to what comes to mind in terms of commenting these verses is what the Buddha says in terms of that the gratification, the danger, and the escape. So essentially, the consideration of of course, there is gratification in experiencing the world with the 5, 6 senses, actually, in the way that we normally do it. So experiencing something as banal and trivial as ice cream and liking it and wanting more and more of it, all the way to some nice architecture, to some beautiful, actually, we were in Italy for a month, and I have to say that my country of origin has really kind of, mastered the art of of sensual pleasures in so many ways. Like all the senses are bombarded by so many different pleasant feelings. Essentially, I was the only one who was used to it in the group, so I was already somewhat dispassionate. That's why I had moved from Italy a bunch of years ago. But it was very interesting to notice these conditions as a Buddhist, and also noticing, how the mind is constricted by sensual pleasures. So we tend to think of having that relationship with sensual pleasures as something that is just pleasant. The more awesome food you have, the better. The more beautiful architecture, the better. And so then we keep on pursuing all of that more and more and more. But actually, the sort of the result is to have a mind that is constricted. But instead, with Buddhist practice, the escape that essentially the Buddha gives us is leads towards the expansion of the mind, and that is going against the stream, essentially. So this is what comes to mind in short. I don't know if Bhante Sudhaza also wants to comment, since he also edited the Terry zine.
Well, I just add to that a line about fervorous nature. So fervorous means in the state of fever. So when you have a fever, then it feels like your body is burning from the inside out. So that's actually what it feels like when we're filled with desire for sensual experiences of any sort. It feels like you're burning from the inside out. So this is an imagery I've always found really helpful, because we tend to associate desire with pleasure, because the experience that we're desiring is assumed to be pleasant. But the actual experience of desire is like being burned from the inside out. So it's not a pleasant experience at all. It's like having a intense fever. Yeah, again, it's emphasizing the importance of paying attention to the unpleasant nature of desire itself. That's all I would add to that.
Thank you, Bante. And Rick says, there is an upheaval in the USA due to a decision by the Supreme Court, and I want to be at peace. Does the Buddha offer any guidance on abortion or the control of government over women? And there is also Dawn, who on the same note says, how to stay in the middle path regarding today's events of the outcome of Roe versus Wade. Asking this out of respect and applying the path to something that is very fresh and raw. So, well, I guess since I have a female body, I should probably address this first. And then maybe the other venerables can share their opinions, since we might have the diverging opinions. But what comes to mind is actually the teachings of the Buddha on, inviting us to ask ourselves with everything, is this beneficial for myself? Is this beneficial for others? Is this beneficial for myself and others? And so we tend to, kind of make these kind of statements on like, this is good and this is bad, but it's a little bit more kind of comprehensive than that. And I would say that each person needs to decide for themselves what is wholesome and what is unwholesome. And definitely, I've noticed, aside from this topic in specific, I've always noticed that people, all of us actually, all of us are people. So all of us, we tend to focus so much on the work of others on doing the work for everyone else rather than doing the work ourselves. I remember there was this girl that I was talking to that was doing a residency in a monastery. And she was complaining that the Thai women at the monastery were offering the best and most delicious food to the monks, and she was disagreeing with that approach, because she said, well, monks actually need to suffer a little bit, so they shouldn't be having like the most delicious and the best food. And I remember thinking, oh, what an interesting sort of reflection. And I replied to her exactly that. I think you should be working on your job, which your job is right now, to do the dana, so to do the best of giving. And then it's the job of the monastic to do the, to make the decision of how they are going to relate to this food and how they're going to, control their mind, etc., etc. But instead, we tend to focus on doing the work for others and actually not doing our work. So then we kind of do sort of like bad karma here and there. So when it comes to these laws and these sort of institutions, well, the Buddha was wise enough not to suggest any control of government over anyone, let alone on women. And he never actually said that I'm aware of anything specific. We have a precept that we're not supposed to essentially interfere with giving suggestions for abortion, essentially, to lay people when they ask us. But we're also not supposed to arrange, kind of relationships or or meetings between lay people as well. So as monastics, we're supposed to be completely out of these matters. And the Buddha never made a kind of like statement in one way or the other, but rather created, my understanding is that he created the conditions for people to make the choice for themselves. And I think that this is what, this is my approach in terms of these issues. The government has many responsibilities, and sometimes, it's not necessarily whether one action is ethical or non-ethical, but rather what is happening in society and how do we address that. So of course, when it comes to abortion, there's also the fact that it has more implications than just simply focusing on the potential life that is coming into being, but it also has a lot of implications on the people who are forced to have pregnancies, and also the fact that regardless, if we see the history of humanity, abortions happen regardless. So whether they happen legally or illegally is the duty of the government to see whether what is, let's say, less harmful. And so the Buddhist teachings are all about harm reduction. So we have to keep that into consideration as well. So what is most harmful for society at large, and what is most harmful for the people involved, and what is the least harmful. So these are just a bunch of reflections. I don't have an answer. I'm not a politician, thank goodness. And I think it's a little bit though sad that we tend to try to control so much other people's lives without getting into their shoes, so to speak. Do the Venerables want to share something else? Dead silence.
I think that's a pretty thorough answer to the subject. I don't really have anything in particular that I could add to it.
No, well, from what I can understand, what this does is bring the power back to the states. So if you live in America and you want to be politically involved, well, then you deal with state laws and state legislation and all that kind of stuff. And like Aya says, the monks can stay out of it. Or at least the ones who want to, anyway.
And also the subject of government control over women. So actually what's happened is it's actually a very important reminder that we can take our current level of personal freedom for granted and not realize how quickly it can be removed. So what we discovered in the last 24 hours is that the rights of women to make their own medical decisions is not something that we can expect to continue. So what else can we not expect to continue? What other personal rights, what other personal freedoms can we no longer rely upon as being an absolute? And the answer is all of them. Every single thing that you take as a personal right or a freedom or something which you think the government should protect your right to do, all of it is subject to be taken away. So the judges give and the judges take away. So it's not always fair, it's not always kind, it's not always compassionate, it's not always just. But this is the nature of government. Governments wield power, and sometimes they wield power in ways which are wholesome, and sometimes they wield power in ways which are unwholesome. So, as Bhante Jay was saying, you do have the option of trying to influence governments in wholesome ways. And in theory, if you're in a democratic republic, as the US claims to be, then in theory, you have some ability to try to influence government decisions in a more wholesome way. But also to some degree, we have to accept that the government does things which are out of our power to affect. And so for that, you can't really do much except practice equanimity on the large scale things. And to ask yourself what you can do on a smaller scale in order to make the world a better place. So, for example, I haven't actually looked into the details, but I'm aware that there are many, many, many non-government organizations which are working to find ways to help people who are negatively affected by government decisions. including this particular government decision. So you can also look into supporting non-government groups, which you think are helping to make the world a more compassionate place. Often influencing the government is difficult, but supporting non-government organizations that are doing good works is often more effective or more beneficial. So yeah, explore your options. And sometimes our options are pretty limited. And in those cases, you always have to fall back on equanimity, because that's all we have.
Okay, thank you, Bantim. And Kumu says, Dear Venerables, what is the most important lesson you realized, understood for sure by direct experience during Tudong? And actually, this can be also applied to you, since you've also done a Tudong. Maybe not as recently, Bante, but in the past.
It's fresh with you.
Well, the most important lesson I realized, understood for sure. Well, what I was sharing this morning, actually, kind of the understanding all the fluff that we get hooked up with, that tendency of the mind of always looking for the escape. Actually, we were talking about earlier with Venerable Dhammadina's quote. The gratification, the danger, and the escape, and the fact that we always tend to find the escape, look for the escape in sensual pleasures, even when we have the teachings of the Buddha. So yeah, actually, that kind of useless sort of way of looking for sensual pleasures, constantly looking for refuge in sensual pleasures, and instead then letting go the escape that actually the Buddha gives us, that is a lot more reliable. And so finding contentment in in something that is not conditioned, that was definitely realized to a certain extent, obviously, during the practice, because also you put yourself in these conditions where they're pretty extreme. So you're kind of like forced to either constantly suffer mentally because of cold, because of like the pain in the muscles, because of the lack of sleep, because of the lack of everything. So also sensual pleasures are kind of unreliable in those contexts to begin with. I mean, there's a little bit of sensual pleasure and you see how the mind grasps towards it. Maybe it's food, maybe it's just the sun. As soon as like the sun starts shining again in the morning after you've been cold for so long, like little things like that. But then when you're actually, when you just let go and you're like, okay, I'm cold and whatever, I'll just be cold. And by the end of the Tudong, my mind was kind of like resigned to that. I already knew I was going to have a bad night, sleeping poorly with cold limbs and and with on a very hard ground and with my hips aching and everything. So I was just like, okay, whatever, I'll just let go of wanting it for it to be different. So then experientially you understand that it's possible to have a happy mind. So I remember actually my venerable monastics, at the very beginning of the Tudong, I was quite complaining here and there. Aware, but I was, waking up, and I'm not the person who tends to repress. I'm actually more of the person of the monastic who tends to express a lot. So I was expressing my distress and my dukkha to my fellow monastics, and then by the end of it, actually, I just became a little quiet, and my fellow monastics were acknowledging it. And first, I remember Bhante Sudaso going, "Oh, did you have a good night's sleep?" And I was like, "No, it was pretty terrible actually, but but I'm all right." And he was like, "Good, good, very well done." So I would say that is definitely the most important lesson, probably. What about you, Bhante?
Persistence. That was what really struck me. So especially with walking, again, we were walking 20, 25 kilometers a day. And you just have to keep going, because what else are you going to do? Don't really have any other option. Like, I remember walking in the evening, trying to find a camping spot, and just walking and walking and walking, and we just couldn't find a good place to camp. So you just keep walking and walking and walking, and eventually you find something which can work, and you go and check it out, and you're like, well, actually this really isn't good, such a good spot. I guess we'll just keep walking. And you keep walking, and you keep walking, and you keep walking, until finally you find a place to camp. So it's this quality of persistence, of like, well, you keep going because you have to. And you realize that when you actually have to do something, then you do have the energy to do it. So that was a very important lesson for me, the power of persistence.
Thank you, Venerable. And then we have a question, actually, that is a follow-up to your instructions earlier, Bante. If attempting to invigorate energy during the boredom part of meditation, would the mind be unknowingly attaching to mental volition, thereby causing pollution?
Attaching to mental volition. And everything you'd be doing is mental volition. I'm not. Would the mind be unknowingly attaching to mental volition? No, you're just choosing to implement some kind of technique that's going to support you in your practice. And yes, of course, that's all mental volition. That's all. Having an intention to do something to go against one of the hindrances. One of the things that are keeping you from staying on the breath. But yeah, you could, if you're bored and you're trying to kind of, I don't know, I didn't necessarily use the word invigorate per se. I think what I was going through the beginning of the 7 factors of awakening. So it's like when you become mindful and you see things that, you notice things that you didn't notice before, and curiosity arises. And then when you investigate that curiosity, then you have energy that arises. That's what I was talking about in that last question. Yeah, I guess that's the best I can answer that.
Thank you, Bante. And Anonymous asks, when meditating, if one tends to fall asleep, often what methods do you recommend?
Meditate with your eyes open. That makes a tremendous difference. Sit up very straight. That also makes a big difference. Drink some tea or some coffee before you start meditating. And if you know that you're sleepy, then before you start meditating, have some tea or coffee. That also helps quite a bit. Don't have too much, because if you have too much, then your mind will become restless. But have just the right amount to keep you awake and alert. You can also try using a more active meditation method. That also can help. You can also try just enduring the feeling of sleepiness. Something interesting that can happen if you just endure the sleepiness for a while, then sometimes it just kind of goes away, just kind of evaporates, and you realize the mind is alert. But usually it's better to use the methods I've just mentioned that can help quite a bit. And sometimes you also just need to face the fact that you're really tired and you need more sleep. So when the Buddha was giving advice on how to deal with sleepiness in meditation, after giving 7 recommendations, then he says, and if this doesn't work, then just go and take a nap. And then after your nap, you can resume meditating. So sometimes that's actually what we really need. So it's good to be practical.
And Melissa says, referencing Rick's comment earlier, is it even possible to support any one law in society without suppressing another? If you're possibly referencing Roe versus Wade or Return Today, it's all sticky. I would say that we're not the best people to ask these questions because we're not legislators, we're monastics. So I would say that would be more law chat rather than monk chat. So
I could say one comment. As somebody who was heavily involved in politics, you do have to realize that politics is force. And so what you say, that's true. But there's no, any kind of government restricts people, right? But we need government, or else it could be all chaos and crazy. So what I would say is, if you get involved in any kind of government, try to any type of law, anything. If you try to push something, think about the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth order consequences. There's lots of consequences that can happen, especially when things are rushed, like when a child dies or something and people want to rush and get a law in, and then there's all kinds of other consequences that can happen. So yeah, politics is a dirty game. And the only thing you can do is try to be mindful if you want to be involved as like an involved citizen.
And since as when it's the Sutra retreat, I believe that is something maybe you're doing something.
Yeah, so it's going to be the second weekend in August. I think that's 13, 14.
Great. Well,
Yeah.
Stay tuned and we'll let you know.
Yeah. I'll put everything out on my website soon.
And Christine asks, is remembering anicca and having gratitude for things instead helpful in countering craving and attachment?
Try it out, see what happens. When you remember that all things are impermanent, does that reduce your craving and attachment? When you remember that the things you're craving are temporary, the things you're attached to are unreliable, does that reduce your craving and attachment? And you'll see the answer is yeah. Being grateful for things, however, does not necessarily reduce your craving and attachment. So look for that as well. Does gratitude reduce craving and attachment? Not necessarily. In fact, gratitude for things can sometimes lead to you developing even stronger attachment to those things. Because as the mind dwells upon the object that you're grateful for, you can start fixating on the pleasantness of that object, and that can increase your attachment. So gratitude itself is a very wholesome mind state, but if you let the mind drift into fixation on pleasure, then that can lead to further desire and attachment. So the main point of gratitude is actually to counter the tendency towards entitlement, the counter self-centeredness. But it doesn't necessarily counter craving and attachment directly. At least those are my thoughts off the top of my head.
Thank you. And so Barua asks, if you're sick, can you observe Ashtashil? I don't know what Ashtashil is.
No idea what that is.
That may be a... Yeah, Attasila.
Attasila. Okay.
Yeah. It looks like
Thank you, Bante.
A Sanskritized, abbreviated pronunciation of Attasila.
Mm-hmm.
You can always observe the 8 precepts, whether you're sick or not. Yeah.
Great. And Jay Kala asks, Ayasoma, do you have any insight on the Garudhammas? Well, what kind of insight would you like? There's no breaking news because they're pretty old. But I would say that there's lots of scholarly research that proves that they are post-canonical. So there's something that was added significantly later on. And also they're in contradiction with many parts of the Bhikkhuni Vinaya. So here at Empty Cloud Monastery, we're focused on early Buddhism, the early Buddhist teachings. So we don't practice the Dhammas because they are not early Buddhist teachings. So that could be an insight. Another interesting thing that I haven't actually researched yet, but it's on my to-do list to research, is that I've heard that actually the Dhammas are in Buddhism are similar, if not the same, in the Jain order of female monastics. So apparently it was not something that was, it's another basically evidence that has nothing to do with Buddhism, but rather it was a way to essentially control women in religion, which is basically the history of all religions worldwide. So that's the insight. I hope that satisfies you. And Craig says, as monks, do you ever listen to different masters like Osho or Muji, or different sects like Tibetan or Mahayana? Bhante Jay?
No. So, so I keep an open mind for things, but I don't go out looking for them. So like I follow the Nikayas, the suttas, the early texts, and there's 5,000 pages of that. There's like I can spend the rest of my life and still not know everything from those pages. So I don't go out like listening and searching from other teachers, even other like Mahayana. I don't spend any time with that. Now, however, I do engage in what would you call it, intra-faith, I guess, in like, so I talk to Mahayana monks and do events, and if I learn things, I learn things. I keep an open mind because I never know what I might learn, even from other religions. Like I've spent for various things, I've spent time at like a Catholic monastery when I was part of an interfaith thing, and I learned stuff from them. I enjoyed hanging out with the Catholic monks, So I keep an open mind, but I don't actively go out and trying to find other teachings.
Yeah, well, I will say that I'm very monogamous when it comes to Buddhism, so I don't really listen to other masters. But within Buddhism, I'm quite polyamorous, so I actually love pretty much every sect of Buddhism, as long as it's not in contradiction with the early teachings of the Buddha, but actually are in an elaboration of that. So as long as it's Dhamma, I'm very happy. When it comes to other spiritual traditions, I have lots of respect for them, but usually I actually have little understanding. This is what I've realized lately. I'm like, it's just kind of like a foreign language. I just don't really understand it, but I'm happy if it makes other people better people, and if it works for them.
Same.
All right. And Anthony says, fun fact, coffee was invented by Sufi monastics and used to stay awake while praying. Great. That's a nice fun fact.
Well, I've heard a million different histories of coffee, so I'll add that one to the list of different histories of coffee I've heard.
Ancient Sufis are supposedly very close to Buddhist monastics.
Oh.
Very, not quite the Sufis like the Rumis and what we hear, but like there's a part of ancient Sufis, like you read, like they're like ascetic and alms round and all that kind of stuff.
Interesting stuff. And Anthony also asks, what is that happens in reincarnation if nothing carries to the next life, as Bhante mentioned? What is reincarnated? Actually, Anthony, we have a really great video on our YouTube channel called
What Gets Reborn?
What Gets Reborn. Perfect. It was done by Bhante Sudaso because your question is one of the frequently asked questions, which is hard to address just in 1 second fully. So then we created a video that is a full-on, in detail. It addresses this question. So I highly recommend it. And then if you have any follow-up questions, you're welcome to ask them in the next monk chat. And Jennifer says, when the grieving process has taken years and attempts to grow past a terrible loss has taken over, what would the Buddha advise? Would Buddhism see this as selfish endeavor at this point?
Well, so grief is a natural effect of losing a loved one. So it's a cause and effect. So it's perfectly natural to experience grief when you lose a loved one. And yeah, sometimes that grief will persist in the mind for years, sometimes many, many, many years, decades even. That's normal. And sometimes it dissipates very quickly, and that's also normal. So more examine your own mind and see, are you doing something to make the grief last longer? Sometimes what happens is we develop a self-identity around grief, and then we hold on to it. We strengthen it rather than allowing it to dissipate and fade away. So make sure you're not doing anything to strengthen the grief, but rather just observe the emotions as they arise and cease. Observe the emotions as they flow through the mind, and observe them as an impersonal, natural, causal process. Not me, not mine, not who I am, just a natural expression of cause and effect. And then there's no problem. There's nothing wrong there.
Thank you. Auntie Jane, do you have any other reflections?
I'm zeroing in on this, the last part of this, because I kind of possibly understand it as a mind state, and this is, would Buddhism see this as a selfish endeavor? And that's an interesting one, because I'm wondering if this person's mind state is like feeling like letting go of the person and moving on, and that feeling like a selfish thing. I don't know. I would have to probably have some more clarification, but I think that we should understand that this is, if you're going through the grieving process, as Bhante said, and you're allowing that to happen, then there will come a time where you move on, and that person is not going to be in your thoughts all the time, and that's not betraying them, that's not being selfish, that's normal. That person, it's still there, but no, there's no selfishness in that, going through the grieving process and allowing it to happen, and then getting to the point where you're moving forward. No, there's not selfish.
Thank you, Venerables. And Vivian asks, could you please share your thoughts on euthanasia?
Well, I mean, pretty directly, the Buddha said that it is unwholesome to kill, and it is unwholesome to cause others to kill. So euthanasia is a form of killing. So whether it's euthanasia of humans or euthanasia of animals, it's still killing. If you have a being which is indisputably a sentient being, and you either kill it yourself or you get somebody else to kill it, then that would seem to be unwholesome pretty clearly, whatever motivation one might have for it. So euthanasia does seem to be pretty solidly in the akusala category, the category of unwholesome acts that we should avoid.
I would say there's, though, a difference between choosing for others and choosing for oneself, in the way that, for example, with an animal, it's very difficult for the animal to express their willingness in one way or the other. As well, it gets a little bit complicated with other sentient beings. And then for ourselves, I think it's a different matter. So, I mean, personally, I think that each person should have the right to choose, essentially, and understand that maybe there's also a lot of mixed karma in that it's maybe euthanasia, but mixed karma. And sometimes things are not that black and white. They can be a lot of different shades of gray. And that's also part of our practice, that we understand, we acknowledge things. We don't pretend that they're all like completely great actions. or completely awful, but we acknowledge maybe there's also something terrible that I'm doing here, but there's also some other good intentions that I'm doing, and this is the best that I can do right now. Jay, what are your thoughts?
The Buddha is asked, what does he approve of killing? And the Buddha says the Buddhas approve only the killing of anger. So the Buddha's pretty hard line on not approving any kind of killing. And of course, as Aya says, there's lots of unfortunate, gray areas, and a line that I've been saying lately is nobody gets out of samsara clean. Right? There's nobody. I mean, I've killed before, even intentionally, I've killed. Even if it's a small being, I've killed. Right? So, this is something that, which if you're going to perform an act that's an act of killing, then you should at least understand the karmic implications of that act.
Thank you, Venerables. And Melissa asks, is there any Dharma on actively choosing the chance of rebirth to end the suffering of another?
I
don't think I understand. Yes. Yeah. Actively choosing the chance of rebirth to end the suffering of another.
Is this like thinking about a specific person and wanting to be reborn to help that specific person? I mean, I don't know.
If you can rephrase it, actually, that would be better, because we are a little bit confused. And Craig asks, when you're ordained, how do they come up with the name you're given? Well, it depends on the preceptor or whoever is suggesting the name. But usually it's either reflecting an aspiration. Sometimes the name is the opposite of actually the qualities of the person that the person holds. Or sometimes actually it reflects the qualities that the person holds. It really depends on the different situations. Or sometimes they have these actually wonderful books of monk names, right? Especially the Thai tradition, there's a book. So maybe in that tradition, it's based on the day of birth. Is that correct?
Yeah, though those books are also not the most reliable, because some of the names listed in the book have the wrong definitions attached to them. And some of the words in the book are not actually Pali or Sanskrit words. They're just made up syllables that resemble Pali words. So there are these books of monk names, but I don't trust them at all. I've encountered monks with names that are utter nonsense, and that's a disappointing thing to find out after you get ordained.
Is it to make sure that there's only 10,000 Bhante such and suches instead of 20,000 Bhante? There is a lot of repetition in the world. There's Ajahn Jayasaro, there's Bhante Jayasara, and there's probably, I don't know, in various Buddhist countries, another 100 Jayasaras at least. I don't know. I've never seen one of these books before.
Okay, and Patricia says, dear Venerables, would there be a possibility of an empty cloud branch or hermitage in Italy? Well, there's definitely the possibility, but then we have to see if the possibility becomes the reality. So we're alms mendicants without money, so it's not really up to us, is it? It really depends on the people and what they put together, etc. So we'll see how things come into being. And Scott says, how did the Venerables support each other in the challenging conditions in Italy?
With compassion, with wisdom, with attention. It's always looking out for each other, paying attention to what each person is going through, and asking ourselves, how can I help? So sometimes it's as simple a thing as looking in your bowl and looking in their bowl and seeing if maybe you have something you can share. So it's I got some tomatoes, but Ayasoma didn't get any tomatoes. Oh, do you want some tomatoes, Venerable? Sometimes it's as simple as that. Or wake up in the morning and you find out that your fellow venerable was really cold because she didn't have any socks. So Bhante Samitta offered her some socks. So just beautiful things like that of just looking out for each other, paying attention to each other, and asking what we can do to help each other. No, monastic life is really beautiful because you get to see the best in each other, and you also get to cultivate the best in yourself.
You've given up mother and father. Who else can take care of you? Your fellow monastics.
Yeah, I think that covers it all. Definitely. Also with patience. We were all, I think, patient with one another. It was actually quite remarkable because we had 4 different nationalities. Is that correct?
American, Italian, Sri Lankan, Thai. Yeah,
yes, 4. We were 6 monastics, 2 lay people, 1 bhikkhuni, and 7 bhikkhus. 6 bhikkhus. 5. Right. Felt like more. And 4 different nationalities and lots of different languages and different ways of practicing, etc. So it was really interesting, actually. I was quite impressed by the end of it that we were all still actually practicing together. And because I remembered the days of my lay life when even with some friends, it was difficult to travel. After 5 days, I was like, all right, I'm done with you. I don't want to see you ever again. Bye. But actually traveling for an entire month, I think we were all very patient with one another, aside from everything. And yeah, patience means like lowering our expectations essentially and being kind of okay, also with ourselves, understanding our limitations and understanding that other people are different and that we all are essentially dependently arisen with our preferences, with our prejudices, with our different ways of or our likings and dislikes, lots of different conditions. And Melissa is elaborating on her message from before. So Lisa says, say an insect is squirming in pain. Say an animal can no longer use their mouth, or maybe another way of putting it, mercy killing, because the suffering is intolerable. Is there Dharma on that?
Again, the Buddha said that killing is unwholesome. So if you perceive a sentient being, so if you see something and you believe that it's a sentient being, and you intentionally kill that sentient being, then that's an unwholesome act. So if you do it out of a belief that you're helping that being, well, then you're mixing in an element of compassion. So as Ayasoma was saying about mixed karma, so shades of gray. So that's a shade of gray, perhaps, but it's still a relatively dark shade of gray because you're still killing a sentient being. And who are you to decide when another being wants to die? Who are you to decide whether or not that's actually the right thing for that being? It's not always clear.
Can I add to that?
Yeah, please.
So 2 things. The first is that, as Bhante was just saying, I've thought about this a lot, and I've thought, you see in the suttas, people who upon their death or close to their death or through various suffering, they attain various attainments, and they gain a lot of insight and things like that. And I've thought of the, you have a natural impulse or a natural inclination to do something. A part of that could be because you just can't stand watching somebody suffer. So a part of that could be because it's on you. But a part of that is also well, maybe this person, maybe this being has to go through this, right? Maybe this, and we don't want to hear that. We don't like that. But maybe that actually will be beneficial for them in the long run. Of course, as Buddhists, we're thinking of not just this life, but future lifetimes as well. And the other one I would say is there are options. For instance, a supporter of mine who just recently, had an issue with her dog. She refused to have the dog euthanized, and then the vet gave them morphine or whatever to take the dog home, and the dog just kind of passed away, morphined up, and which they do to humans as well. I've held the hand of people, who die peacefully because they get morphine at the end, and so there are other options oftentimes too. So watch out for how much of that is your own uncomfortableness with suffering, and think about that other person's karma, and think about other options that can be done.
Yes, thank you, Bhante, for mentioning that. Actually, that was an interesting consideration that I also had last year when our monastery cat was deadly sick. Like any minute, he was about to pass out, and so I really actually, the vet was suggesting euthanasia, and obviously for our precepts, it's just not something that we will do ever. It was not on as an option, but I really had a lot of compassion for people who are in the same situation, because it was really dreadful and horrible to see someone suffering so much, like a beloved friend. But I did ask myself that question. I was like, wow, for example, would this euthanasia be more for myself than for the actual sentient being, because it was so intolerable to see him suffer? And these are interesting questions that not necessarily will find, really perhaps an answer in this lifetime, but it's good to keep it in mind of also how sometimes we think that there's only one option, but that's the option that it's more to, trying to eliminate suffering by eliminating what we think is the problem, but in reality, we're creating another problem. So yeah. It's difficult. This path is difficult. And Sin says we need more women monastics. I completely agree.
Well, Sin, you can get ordained.
Well, is Sin a woman? We don't know.
I think.
It looks like it in the picture.
Oh, there's a picture.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't see it.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, there's definitely the need for more women monastics, but in order to have more women monastics, we need to support monasteries that ordain women. So you can support all the bhikkhuni monasteries. They will be gladly appreciative of the support. And also there is an organization called Alliance for Bhikkhunis that supports bhikkhunis worldwide. So that's another way through which we can have more women monastics in the world. And Nico has a few questions that I'm not sure I understand. How the soul may support each other in Las Vegas for Buddhist. And maybe that's a autocorrect thing. So the other question is, if a rebirth soul transferred to insect and people kill insect, how the soul of yourself may go?
Well, first off, there's no such thing as souls, so you don't need to worry about rebirth souls transferring to anything at all. But we do have the idea of in each moment we're taking on a new form, and sometimes the form that we take on is the form of an insect. And if that insect form dies, then we just take on another form. And that other form might be, again, as an insect, or as another animal, or as a human, or as a spirit, or an angel, or anything really. So, yeah, I don't really understand what you're asking here. There's no problem here.
And Rick asks, can you share some reflections on freedom? Years ago in the 12-step work, I discovered that a selfish perceived loss of freedom frequently generated unskillful mind states of resentment and fear. In Buddhist practice, I found great relief when I learned the difference between being free to satisfy my desires and instead being free from desire. So can you share some reflections on freedom, maybe Bhante J?
Yeah, there's lots of types of freedom. And most of my life, I screamed freedom. I wanted freedom. It was such a thing. The founding fathers and various Braveheart and things like that. I thought about being free as a person. Having rights and things like that. But then, as I started to develop on the path, I realized, well, even that's not really free. The ultimate freedom is nibbana. And so I've adjusted my path to move towards and to practice towards what is the ultimate freedom. Right? What is the, as Bhante said, even, in what we would call classical liberal, perspectives, you are born with rights, right? These rights are inalienable, right? But still, governments can just still say, okay, well, I'm taking it away. That's the way it goes. And if you read like people like, I don't know, like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and like Viktor Frankl, people who are being gulags and been in concentration camp. Viktor Frankl is a concentration camp survivor of World War II. They talk about things like how your mind can be free even though your body is not. And I think that's really the most important freedom, is the freedom of the mind, Ceto Vimutti. Right? Whether it's temporary freedom or permanent freedom when you become awakened. And I think that that's a freedom that nobody can take away from you. You've won that freedom. You've earned that freedom. You've gone down the path and developed that freedom. And bandits could be taking you, sawing you limb from limb, like the Kakachupamu Sutta. They don't take away your freedom, right? Like the line from Braveheart, they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom. I remember that line, like, oh, I love that line so much. I'm going to fight for my freedom. But now it says the freedom is on the path over there, and I'm following that path so I can really get the freedom that nobody can take away in this lifetime or the next.
Sadhu, 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 maybe so. And finding oneself asks, as monks, what's your opinion on Taoism, and are there similarities between the two with Buddhism? Also, have you read Tao Te Ching or Tao Te Ching? Well, I'll pass this on to Bhante Siddhartha because I don't know much about Taoism.
So before I got into Buddhism, I did study Taoism as well as many other spiritual systems. And I did read the Tao Te Ching many, many years ago now. Are there similarities? Yeah, there's some similarities, but there's also a lot of differences. And differences both in methods and also difference in goal. So it's very important to keep in mind that different spiritual systems often have different goals. So there's this old saying of like, it's all just different paths up the same mountain or whatever. But actually, I think that's completely false. That actually different spiritual systems are often going up different mountains. They're going towards different objectives. And this is definitely the case with Taoism and Buddhism. They're not going towards the same objective. They're going towards different objectives. So yeah, there's some similarities, but that doesn't mean they're doing the same thing, and it doesn't mean they're going towards the same direction. So it's important to be clear. What are you trying to do with your practice, and what methods will help you get towards your goal?
Great, thank you. And Patricia says, Dear Venerables, when you decided to take the monastic path, what did you find mostly supportive? Precepts. That's actually why I decided to take the monastic form. As a layperson, I started getting addicted to precepts. I really love precepts, working with precepts, understanding precepts, and looking at my mind while following the precepts. Then gave me a lot of passion in like taking the monastic form, the passion that leads to this passion. And I would say not just taking them blindly, but really understanding the purpose behind each rule, and also noticing how it affects the mind when we're practicing in accordance to the Vinaya, and what happens when we're practicing not in accordance with the Vinaya. The ultimate purpose of these precepts with the Bhikkhuni Vinaya can be particularly interesting, because actually there can be some precepts that are in contradiction one with the other, because there's been a bit of manipulation of the texts throughout history. So then you really cannot just sit comfortably and kind of just do this sort of blindly following every precept, because you'll go kind of insane sometimes. So like, wait, which one am I supposed to, practice? So some people find that a little bit demoralizing. I actually find it so exciting. It really works so well for my mind, because actually you have to do, once again, this questioning of what is the intention, and also how does this support my practice of Dhamma. So that is the most important thing, that it's not that there is the Dhamma and there's the Vinaya and there's these two separate things, but rather there is the Dhamma that we need to realize, and the Vinaya, that it's this beautiful support to it. So by doing this observation, it's essentially a practice of meditation in and of itself, observing the mind while it's practicing the different silas. You really can see how the mind grows in Dhamma, or how the mind actually can be obstructed in its realization of the Dhamma. So obviously there needs to be a lot of different supports in order to find the Vinaya supportive, the Bhikkhuni Vinaya supportive, but it's very enjoyable. I love it. So that would be my answer. I don't know if the other venerables want to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, it would be the nibbida that I developed and my confidence on the path. I mean, that is what's basically sustained me the whole time. Really, the confidence in the Buddha and the Dhamma and the Sangha, but the confidence in that this is something that will be better for me than lay life. And that's what's sustained me. And nibbida, for those of you who don't know, like the dispassion or disenchantment. So like I practiced for a number of years before I became a monk. So I came in pretty well armed with disenchantment and some dispassion. And that's also been very supportive. And then later, trying to develop good Kalyana Mittas in the monastic life has been very supportive as well.
Great, thank you.
So for me, a sutta study. So reading the suttas just really underlines the value of monastic life, and how monastic life is, as Ayasoma was saying, it's a support to realizing the Dhamma. So for me, this comes through very clearly in reading the suttas. It makes it really clear that in order to fully and deeply realize the Dhamma, monastic life is a very powerful way of supporting that realization.
Thank you. And Kristen says, after a week-long retreat, I felt a sense of release and saw that most thoughts are delusional. But upon returning to daily life, I slipped back into habitual ways. Do monastics experience similarly? Anyone wants to answer this question?
Yeah, of course. Of course. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back.
This is a very common thing. And I experienced this myself going on retreats. I'm sure most monastics who did retreats and stuff in lay life, the same thing. You go on retreat, what you're doing is you're secluding yourself from everything that is normal to you. You're going to what we call a novel situation, like a monastery, especially if it's your first time. You're away from all the habitual things, your habitual environments, your job, your family. You're away from all of that. And that actually, like, it becomes a conducive environment for you to practice and gain insight and have mental seclusion. And then, you leave the monastery and you feel, or, the retreat center, and you feel really zealous and you feel, wow, I've had such good insights. And then, after a week, it starts to slip a little bit. And then after the second week, it's more. And then by a month later, it's like, you're gone. Right? That's totally normal. Right? And when you first become a monk, maybe it's all new, but then monk life becomes normal life. And so all the habits and everything, have a chance to come back. So so that's totally normal, whether you're a lay person or a monastic.
Great, thank you. And Jason says, Venerables, do you think there are any practical advantages for studying the suttas in the Pali language instead of through translations? Yes, absolutely. There's many advantages. The foremost advantage, and actually two advantages that resound to me are one, the fact that actually you start realizing that a lot of the translations, if not all the translations that are currently present, have a lot of are very heavily inspired by the commentaries. So then sometimes they're not true to the original text, and the meaning can be radically different because it's inspired by the commentaries. So having a knowledge of the Pali language gives you a direct experience of the text. And then you can actually approach it without any sort of intermediate interpretation. And then the second is to actually have a better understanding of the Dhamma. It's just basically part of the process of translation. So that would be what I would have to say. This being said, though, first study the translations and then get to studying the suttas in Pali, because it otherwise doesn't make any sense, because you wouldn't have even kind of a general idea of what the suttas talk about or what the Dhamma is about to begin with. Maybe we can address all the other ones because we have just a few minutes left. Jay Kala says, what are your thoughts on the differences between early Buddhism and the practice of the Thai forest with some of its esoteric and Visuddhimagga practices?
So being a practitioner of early Buddhism does not mean that you reject everything after early Buddhism, but rather it means that you are evaluating such practices in terms of whether or not they line up with early Buddhism. So the Buddha was always emphasizing that we want to focus on the effects of our practice. So if somebody following an esoteric practice or a Visuddhimagga practice is increasing their factors of awakening, then that's good. That fits with early Buddhism. Even if it's a practice that's not specifically mentioned in the early Buddhist texts, if it's producing the wholesome mind states that are mentioned in the early Buddhist text, then it's good. And that said, there may also be some practices which are not helpful for awakening. And if you study the early Buddhist texts, you can also pick out the things which are in contradiction to the early Buddhist texts and recognize them as something which is counterproductive to the path. Yeah, I mean, I can't say much more without specific examples being brought up, but that's my general thoughts on the matter.
Thank you, Bantim. And Robert asks, I find myself worrying whether I understand something or have simply read enough that I have an intellectual understanding. How can I know the difference, and does it matter? Well, I will quote Bhante Ji on this, who invited us to ask ourselves the question, how do we know if we're hungry? Right? We just know it. So that's the difference between an intellectual understanding and an experiential understanding. So when we have an experiential understanding, we just know things. If we have an intellectual understanding, then we ask ourselves the question whether or not we have it, or, it becomes still in the domain of the intellect. And of course, it matters because in Buddhism, the Dhamma invites us to see for ourselves. So we have to attain all the stages of awakening experientially, not just by understanding what we have to do. Understanding what we have to do is good. So we're kind of going in the right direction, hopefully. But it's not in and of itself the path. And Anthony says, if a layman wishes to begin to read Buddhist scripture, where and how should they start?
I would suggest In the Buddha's Words by Bhikkhu Bodhi. You can go on like suttacentral.net, you can go on accesstoinsight.org, and all of the suttas are there for you. But in terms of like having it's like having a teacher basically give you a crash course on like all of the major themes in the suttas. In the Buddha's Words, that's the best one. to get to really help you to kind of get an overview and a good basis, a good start to, reading the suttas on your own. In the Buddha's words, by Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi.
Great. Thank you, Bantam. And Anthony asks, what is your preferred emptiness meditation practice? Sutasu?
Silent elimination, according to the instructions by Chan Master Shengyan.
And thank you. And Finding Oneself asks, what do you think of the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh? Do you like his teachings? I think he's good. Also, do you know about Alan Watts? He wrote many good books on Zen and Buddhism. Thich Nhat Hanh is great. I think he's good. Me too. Alan Watts, yes, I know him. And Shadow Levo says, how do you guys care for others while not caring what other people think? Jane? We have 4 minutes to finish all the questions.
Yeah. So you have to get over the fact that really, honestly, for the most part, practicing getting over what people think in general is an important aspect of growing up and being confident in yourself and saying, like, I'm going to do what's right, or what I see is right. I could be wrong, but I'm going to do what I see is right, no matter what other people think. That's easy said than done. You have to practice at it, but it's about letting go of caring for what other people think.
Great, thank you. And Scott asks, when I encounter the results of unwholesome karma in the mind, I make an adhitthana to never repeat the actions. How do the Venerable feel about this?
Overall good, but I would rewrite that slightly to make an adhitthana to try to not repeat the actions. Because the truth is you're going to continue making mistakes from time to time. So you want to give yourself preliminary forgiveness for your future mistakes. Otherwise, you can fall into self-hatred, which is not helpful at all.
Great, thank you. And Finding Oneself asks, how does one learn to live themselves and find self-worth in themselves? How does someone start being happy with who they are and not see themselves as useless? Also, how do you overcome depression? Well, essentially, depression is a vipaka, so of karma that we've done in the past. So there's not much that we could do right now for our depression, except actually learning from it and understanding it, and also being okay to also ask for help to people that are trained to help us with that. And what we can, though, focus on, rather than always trying to change the consequences, we can control the causes. So doing actions. So what we can do right now is new karma. We can't control the vipaka, but we can control the karma. And do things that make you happy, like letting go. And letting go, not necessarily just in meditation, but actually going and doing dana. Go to the closest monastery next to you and offer meals. Make acts of kindness towards your relatives and your family, your neighbor, or whoever you meet on the street. Do nice things for yourself and also for others. And in that way, actually, the mind becomes happy. It's just as simple as that, really. When we started Buddhist Insights, I was working so much, offering so many things for so many people. Well, after a few months, my depression completely disappeared, even though I had been suffering depression since basically I could remember, basically all my life. And that's because it was generating so much new karma that had the vipaka of happiness, essentially. The more you do things for others, the more you do things for yourself. And and that's how we accumulate good things that make us happy. So that would be my last question. There's 1 minute. If any of the venerables want to add anything on this question.
Yeah, sila nusati, recollection of your own virtue. This actually will resolve every single one of your questions. All 3 of your questions can be answered with this one word, sila nusati, recollection of your own virtue. Of course, that depends on you having virtue. So if you don't, it's time to take the 5 precepts and start following them. And then you have something to remind yourself of.
Sadhu. All right. There's so many sweet messages. Thank you to all of you. The Shadow Label says, extending monk chat to 10 would make me happy. Would make us very exhausted, though. So let's keep it to 9 for now. Anyway, thank you so much for joining in. So next week we'll be live streaming the usual hours, and there will also be hopefully Bhante Sumita. Tonight he was supposed to join us, but he arrived a little bit too late. But next week, hopefully, it will all be all the monastics. So thanks again for joining in. If you're around Empty Cloud Monastery, this weekend we will have on Sunday, we'll have the usual meditation program in the afternoon, and you can also come and volunteer in the morning at Empty Cloud. That would be gratefully appreciated. And starting next week, we will also be doing alms round in the morning at the Montclair Farmers Market, and then in the evening there will be evening meditation. So both Saturday and Sunday, you're always welcome at the monastery. And also if you want to come and visit us and do a residency at the monastery, that's also possible. So you can just visit the website and send us an email. All right. Well, may you all be well and happy, and may all good things come to you. We can end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.